Oops. My pointer. Here we go. Fantastic. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our fourth lecture. So today we are going to have a very quick recap of the previous three lectures, just to make sure that we are on the same page here, and look deeper in the topic of the structured Gaussian processes and their use for Bayesian optimization and hypothesis learning. So from lectures 2, we learned the general principle of the Gaussian process. So what Gaussian process is, it's a complicated concept. We can look at it from many different angles, from very fundamental mathematic perspective, all the way to the kind of practical use. This is the method that allows us to interpolate the function and estimate what the uncertainties are. So my suggestion is to look at it from the purely practical viewpoint, because that's ultimately what this course is about. And mathematical details can become important, but ultimately what we want to learn is to how to use them rather than understand their full mathematical beauty. We looked at the concept of the sort of what is kernel and kernel parameters, and particularly what the priors and the noise priors are and how they affect the Gaussian process. So there is a general belief that Gaussian process is a robust thing, meaning that we can use it without thinking about those parameters. This belief is supported by the fact that Gaussian process should always converge. This belief is also not terribly relevant to the real world situations, because in practical scenarios, what matters for us is not whether it is will converge given the infinite number of operations, number of experimental steps, but whether it will converge within the experimental budget that we have. So it's far more important. So we looked at the Bayesian optimization. So the types of the Bayesian optimization that are based on minimizing the uncertainty, a type of the Bayesian optimization where we actually try to find the minimum or maximum of the function. We talked about the acquisition function as the way to balance uncertainty and the prediction, and that the acquisition function can very naturally include the cost of the measurement. The cost of the measurement can be known a priori. The cost of the measurement can be something that we learn. So it is a very different scenario whether we know the costs or whether we do the measurement and learn the cost afterwards. But both can be implemented using the Gaussian processes. So then we talked about how we can introduce the noise in the Gaussian process. So in the simple one, the noise is the same everywhere. We assume that the measurement gives us the same noise no matter where we are in the parameter space. So there are several ways of how we can supersede this limitation. So heteroscedastic Gaussian process allows us to learn function and the noise. So the measured noise Gaussian process allows us to work in the scenarios when we can measure the function and its noise at the same time. Notice that if we do that, then we will need the model for predicting the noise at the unmeasured locations. So the GPAX implementation I've shown does it through the either general Gaussian process or through the linear model, but in principle, the noise model can be anything. And the final thing that we talked about is the noise and position in the parameter space. So the most important take-home message for all those measurements, all those variants of Gaussian process, is that they start to come with a very large number of priors. So we have the prior on the kernel for the function itself. We can prior for the noise on the function. We will have the priors for the noise measurement. We will have priors for the noise and the position in the parameter space. So remember that if you take a Gaussian process out of the box, these parameters are what the software writer has specified them to be, which means that it would be something fairly general and non-informative. So in those cases, the Gaussian process can work in a very many ways that you would not be particularly interested in. So for example, depending on how we save the noise prior, this type of wiggles on the function can be perceived to be the true value, or it can be perceived as the implementation of the noise. So setting the priors correctly is super important, and it's important to set them up based on what you really know about the system, and then learn how to deal with the outcome. So it's okay to be a little bit optimistic when it comes with this type of noise priors. It's probably okay to be somewhat pessimistic when it comes with the noise for the measured function, because there can be always noise. But generally, it's better to stick close to what you expect happening in the experiment, because otherwise the Gaussian process can simply start going under the wrong target. So best advice that I can give is that don't treat the priors as the optimization parameters, because ultimately we use this for the experiment, and experimental reality has a lot of other moving blocks other than the optimization parameters. So question is, when does the simple Bayesian optimization becomes useful? So as I mentioned, the type of applications where it can work very well are the scenarios where our discovery function is relatively well behaved. So it has relatively small number of protrusions and depressions. So it has a simple structure. And our exploration space is low dimensional. So if you want to do something like optimize the growth condition for the material inside the PLD chamber, Gaussian process can be good. If you want to explore the evolution of the ferroelectric properties across the compositional phase diagram or hardness, Gaussian process can be good. It can be done better with the structured Gaussian processes, and it will be a topic of today's discussion, but generally Gaussian process is good enough. So it's practically useful. So what you can see in the screen that goes on at this moment is the example of the simple Bayesian optimization, which tries to improve the scanning condition on the scanning probe microscope in my lab. So you can see that we scan the surface, we figure out some form of the quality of the image based on what the microscope shows. So actually figuring out this optimization function to be optimized or reward function is the most difficult part of the process. But once we've done it, we can have the simple Bayesian optimization that basically tries to tune the microscope. And then once the microscope is tuned, we determine the parameters that we think are good, and then we can get an image on those parameters. So obviously a human operator can also do that, but it takes considerably longer. And the interesting point is how close can we approach to the qualified human operator. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So the second thing that we talked about is the functional fit. So notice that once we talk about the functional fits, we start with a very different worldview. So Gaussian process tries to discover the functions that are consistent with the experimental data and satisfy certain constraints in terms of how smooth they are. Functional fit does a totally different thing. We come up with the structure of our physical structure behind our data in form of the structural model. And then we try to say that this is our structure, this is the data, let's refine the parameters of the model. So I've shown you the example of how the fitting works. Is actually very straightforward. We've been doing it since the high school. There is a problem that the classical least square fit has a number of very significant limitations. So we cannot incorporate prior knowledge. It is easy to make it converge to the metastable minima. And it's kind of very easy to create a pathological example, even in one-dimensional space where the least square fit doesn't work. Obviously, in the high-dimensional spaces, the number of pathological situations would be much larger. So I've shown you how we can use the Bayesian inference as the way to deal with this type of problem. So we still have a function, but rather than having the rigid set of parameters that we try to optimize, we come up with the priors, meaning the distribution on the parameter values. So if we do that, that instead of fitting the function in the normal way, we fit it in the Bayesian way, meaning that we find the predictive distributions, so how the data generated can look like. We can find the possible functions, kind of how they can be distributed. we find the posteriors on the parameter values. And most importantly, we can accomplish the same goal as in the Gaussian process, which is to predict the function and its uncertainty. So once we predict the function and its uncertainty, that means that we already can use the Bayesian optimization framework, because insofar we have a prediction and uncertainty, Bayesian optimization can be used. So notice that these things sometimes get convoluted. So very often we talk about the Bayesian inference, Bayesian optimization, Gaussian process without the kind of clear understanding of how they're connected. Realistically, they're very different. So Gaussian process is one of the ways to give us the interpolation and its uncertainty. So get a surrogate model with uncertainty. There are many other ways to get a surrogate model with uncertainty. Bayesian inference can give us the model parameters and uncertainty, but so can the physics-informed neural networks, ensemble networks, and so on. So once we run the Bayesian inference, we get the posterior distributions on the parameters. This is super convenient because exploring this posterior distribution basically tells us kind of how much we can trust things, what the distributions are, is there likely to be parameter dependence or not. So we can estimate that learning a little bit beta 1 will not help us understand beta 3 or beta 4, which makes sense. Beta 1 is the slope here, beta 3 and 4 slope and intercept here, they're just not connected. In other cases, learning one parameter helps us understand another parameter better. So for example, if I know the beta 1 better, I can definitely narrow down the behavior for the beta 2. So we basically learn how to examine these outputs. And the most important thing about the Bayesian inference is that it provides us structure and regularization even in the cases when the noise is super high. So for example, if my data looks like this, the dots here, and my ground truth looks like this, if I give you the data only without any model, the only thing you would be able to do is to fit it by the straight line. That's the only thing that is justified. Bayesian inference is powerful enough to actually work in this type of scenarios. If I say that I have a step function with the broad priors, this is the fit it will give me. So it's not super good, but it's definitely not linear. And if I say that the jump position has to sit somewhere between 2 and 2.5, then the fit will actually be super good. And again, in this case, we can also explore the posteriors, and the posteriors basically tell us quite a lot about the possible structure of this function. So for example, if I see that this T shows like these three distributions, that basically tells me that its position can be between these 2 points with one probability, these 2 points with the probability proportional to area under this peak, or between these 2 points with the probability proportional to the area under this peak. So it's after a while that becomes a very easy thing to interpret. Finally, we also talked about a way how we are going to approach the problem if we have more than one model. So in this case, there are two primary ways. One is to build a hierarchical Bayesian model, meaning that we choose multiple functions. We ascribe to each function the prior probability, and then we fit with the data, our data with this kind of integrated function. It's usually fairly time consuming. So the easier way to do that is to basically enumerate the models that we have and then fit our data using all those models. And once we fit it, use the criterion such as WIAC, widely applicable information criteria, to estimate which of those models work better. So WIAC is in some senses a hybrid between the classical frequency-based approach and the Bayesian approach. So it is based on the Bayesian fits and the samples that we get during the Bayesian inference, but it makes the comparison more like the classical frequency-based approaches. So this being said, do you have any questions? So if not, then one thing that I wanted to share with you kind of without going a little bit beyond the Bayesian methods, is the concept of the symbolic regression. So I posted this notebook on the course GitHub, so please feel free to experiment with them. But basically, symbolic regression is the very powerful method if we have a data, but we don't know what functional form it has. So very often we use our own common sense in order to say that this data looks like it can be fitted by the tangent function, this data looks like it has to be fitted by the parabola, and so on and so forth. So in other cases, we have the structural model, the functional model that follows from our knowledge of physics. However, there can be environments when we are not certain about what the physics should be. And this is the case where the symbolic regression can be used. So historically, people have been working on it for quite a while. So the previous time symbolic regression made wave was about 10 years ago when Todd Lipson at Cornell has come up with the program Eureka. There were quite a lot of Python-based, but Eureka has become proprietary. So there were quite a few Python-based implementations like QLattice and whatever. But I think that the inflection point was the software system called PySR, which was developed by Miles Cranmer, who is now, who was at that time at the Flatiron Institute. Now he is a professor at Cambridge. So PySR is very easy to use. So it's just usual pip install in Python. It will take quite a long time to load because the backend for the PySR is the Julia language rather than Python. So it may take quite a while, but after you get it, you basically get an approach of fitting your data and finding the best formula that can represent it. So this is the example that I've made based on this blog post. So essentially the idea is that we create some abstract data using some formula. Then we look how this data looks like. So the red points are the data points. The green surface is the underpinning function. Experimentally, we have access to the data, but not to the function that describes where the data has come from. So this is just another way to realize it. So if you look at the code above, there is nothing special about it. It's just a data generation. So the interesting part is the PySR. So the way it works is, as everything in Python, the useful things are packaged together to be very compact, and the number of modifying parameters that you have is very significant. But basically what you do is you create a model. So this model comes with a large number of parameters, such as number of iterations, that's obvious, population size. This comes from the fact that PySR uses the genetic algorithm to find the run expression. So the important parameters are what operators are we allowed to use. So this is the simple example when I use only binary operators, multiply and minus, or plus for that matter. But I can also use the operators like square or exponential. So obviously this list can be expanded. So we can use quite a lot of other operations, and we can even create our own using the lambda functions. So we need to define the loss function. The loss function describes how should the algorithm determine the mismatch between the data and the formula prediction. There are ways how we can study the complexity of the expressions. So we can say that we force the expressions to be very simple, or we make them very complicated. So the same thing applies with the constants and variables. So all in all, if you're interested, it's really worth going through the Miles Cranmer paper. I'm so showing just to make sure that we covered some tools that can be very useful in real life. But once you create this regressor, all you have to do is to apply it to the data, and then magic happens. So basically what it is going to produce is, given the data, it will provide a string of expressions of increasing complexity that describe the data better and better. So for example, with the zero complexity, we just model the data as the line. It's not super good, but it is what it is. So with the slightly improved complexity, we use it as the linear slope. Then it will become quadratic function and so on and so forth. So eventually, then we need to figure out how we want to balance the prediction, the complexity of the model, and kind of quality of the fit. So in this case, PySR makes a suggestion. So for example, in this case, it says that this model is probably the best. And that's actually the ground truth model in this case. But in other cases, that becomes your choice. So I've shown you the example of how it works. And I have also added to the notebook the example of how we can use the PySR for the real world problem. So using the Ising model to calculate the temperature dependence of the heat capacity and so on, so this is how our data look like. It's an output of some physics model. So what we can do is to use the PySR in order to find out what is the formula that best describes this data. And as you can imagine, if the PySR have suggested the functional forms, we can actually use them and create the Bayesian models based on them. So in this case, it's a very new and fairly unexplored direction in general, but the number of opportunities that the combination of the symbolic regression and Bayesian inference open is really staggering. So anyway, I posted this notebook on the GitHub just as the way to make the story complete. So let me know if you have any questions about it. If not, then we will go back to the Bayesian optimization. Okay, so then with this short foray into the symbolic regression, let's go back to the Bayesian in the Gaussian processes and talk about not only when they work, but also the cases when the Gaussian processes actually don't work. And once we deal with the Gaussian process and GP-based Bayesian optimization, there is a number of very significant limitations that become obvious actually very, very fast. So first of all, they work well only in the low-dimensional spaces. So there is a big difference between work and work well. So in principle, we can construct Gaussian process in any any dimension, and they will learn some form of correlation across each dimensional axis. So that's not really a problem. However, in many of these Gaussian processes will be not very informative. And what is going to happen is that unless we have a sufficient experimental data that allows us to build a model that is sort of representative of our process, we will get answers, but they would be not very useful and not very related to the ground truths that we're interested in. So the second problem, in other words, Gaussian process still needs data. So second part, which is super important, is that our Gaussian processes have a zero mean function, and basically all the structure of the function that we're interested in are introduced via the kernel function. And this is the most interesting part about the Gaussian process community, is that if you pick any of the even recent books like Crom and Garnett that talks about the Gaussian processes, they have a very, very minimal mention of the fact that the mean function can be adjusted based on the domain needs. Then they will say that the mean function is something that is domain related, and therefore we are not going to talk about it. And then most of the book will be dedicated to the exploration of how the kernels can be engineered. So we can add kernels, we can multiply kernels by constant, we can create the whole grammars based on kernels. that's actually super interesting and super useful, except for the end for practical applications, that rarely becomes important. So then the third limitation is that imagine that we want to use the Bayesian optimization for some specific physical problem. It is very, very rare that we don't know anything about the physics of the system. So for example, I can use the Bayesian optimization to predict the optimal mobility in the multi-component mixture. But most of the time, I have a model of how the mobility in the multi-component mixture will depend on concentration. Maybe more than one model, it can be modeled with unknown parameters, but generally I don't expect my behavior to be kind of very wiggly. I expect to have either enhancement or vice versa depression due to something like a mixed alkali effect. If I study the behavior of the material system as the function of temperature, most of the time I have some mental model of how the material's properties can depend on temperature. So most of the time I think that the native model would be something like Arrhenius form. I know that it's not necessarily the case. For example, if I studied the ionic conductivity of Syria, it will have a anti-Arrhenius shape before 100C and then Arrhenius above. And the reason for that is below 100C, the ionic mobility is controlled by water and not by the oxygen vacancies. So if I increase the temperature, water gets removed and the mobility actually decreases. But then the vacancies kick in and they start to accelerate. In other cases, there can be phase transition. Then the mobility as the function of temperature can exhibit a jump. But in all those cases, we kind of have a principle of the parsimony that explains that the number of behaviors cannot be that large. And secondly, we also have the principle that we typically have physical models that generalize over multiple classes of possible behaviors. So ideally, if we want to use the Gaussian processes for experimental sciences, we want to find a way to incorporate this prior knowledge, however probabilistic and imprecise, to be a part of our experiment. Then the final thing is that very often, so I'll talk about it later, but since we here want to summarize the limitations of classical GPs, we are very often not using cheap information available during the experiment. So for example, if I want to synthesize the material using the pipetting robot, I have my plate of the synthesized crystals. And very often I will know whether the experiment was successful or not, even before doing the detailed photoluminescent measurements. So simply because if the experiment didn't work well, I have a yellow precipitation of the lead iodide. So again, we never run experiments in the black boxes. We always have some form of the observables throughout the experimental workflow. Therefore, if we want the Bayesian optimization to become useful, we actually need to learn how to incorporate this type of information before even we start an experiment. So notice that in the classical Bayesian optimization, all we have are priors. So this is the only way how we can incorporate the physical knowledge. That's not bad. It can allow us to incorporate the knowledge of the measurement system, but absolutely not enough. Our knowledge generally in our domain goes well beyond the noise measurements. So how are we going to do that? So let's look at so throughout this course, we are going to look at the several examples of using the multi-fidelity Bayesian optimization, deep kernel learning, and the structured Gaussian processes. So let's start with the structured Gaussian processes. So relatively speaking, it is the easiest one to understand because in some sense, it's almost like a hybrid between the Gaussian process and the Bayesian inference. So the way it works is that Gaussian process is essentially a multivariate normal distribution, which is determined by some kernel function. And in the example that I have shown, there is a mean function, and the mean function is 0. So what we can do is rather than having the mean function 0, we can choose the mean function to be a probabilistic model of our physical behavior. So in other words, it is exactly, I mean, it's oversimplifying, so it's not a rigorous statement. But essentially, we try to take what the Gaussian process is good at, what the Bayesian inference are good at, and kind of combine them together. So this is how it looks mathematically. So it's obviously not terribly understandable, but this is how it looks practically. So remember that the standard Gaussian process works like this. We start with the priors. Our priors are all functions that have this wiggly behavior with the kind of smoothness of the wiggles dependent on what their kernel is. If we take our experimental measurements, we assume that we fixed the value of the function at the measured points, which means that out of these possible priors, only those that pass through this point survive. Another important thing is that in this, we don't see it here, but we also kind of narrow down on what the kernel lengths and noise priors are once we do that. And then we do our averaging, and then we get the prediction and its uncertainty. So this is the classical GP, which basically says that, okay, our mean function is 0. This is how the structured GP will look like. In this case, the prior predictive distributions are no longer the functions that go like this. It will be the functions that have some specific functional form. So I define them as a probabilistic model, same way as I will do it in the Bayesian inference. So for example, I can choose that my function would be offset minus, and there would be 2 peaks. I can choose the prior distribution of the offset, so it is anywhere between minus 10 and 10. I introduce the structural form for the peaks, so it is Lorentzians, almost Lorentzians. And I can introduce the priors on what the parameters here are. So for example, I can say that, and in this case, they are fairly broad, but I can easily say that, for example, the first peak, rather than be anywhere from 0 to 1, can be only from 0.2 to 0.4. And then the second peak can be somewhere between 0.6 and 0.8. So making these models take some time. You need to kind of very clearly define your prior knowledge, but the way they work is rather amazing. So let me show you first few examples of how the structured Gaussian process work compared to the normal Gaussian process, and how they can be used for scientific applications. And then I'll show you the notebook where we actually use them. So what you see here is the illustration of the simple Gaussian process, where we visualize the exploration and we visualize the acquisition function. So the black line here is the ground truth. So the Gaussian process doesn't have an access to the ground truth. The crosses are the seed points. So this is points where we do the measurements before we even start the active learning. So the dots are the sample points, and they have color that is kind of proportional to their number. So you see when the dots appear, their color changes, so you can see the history of exploration up to a given moment. And then the red line is the Gaussian process reconstruction. So obviously, our goal is for the red line to become to coincide with the black line. So then we have discovered the behavior of the function. So the trick here is that our ground truth function has a jump. And the jump is the problem for the classical Gaussian process, simply because jump means that here the correlation length in the kernel is very, very small. But Gaussian process, at least the normal Gaussian process, uses the same kernel lengths everywhere, which basically means that if you look at how the red curve evolves, what goes on is that the GP discovers the behavior of the function at these tails. Then it starts to realize that something goes on here. And once it realizes it, it will make the kernel length smaller, but once the kernel length is made smaller, the Gaussian process has to remeasure the behavior in this part and this part, because there is no way for us to impart the knowledge that there is only one jump. So Gaussian process thinks that if there is a jump here, then the jumps can be here or here. And that's the only thing that it can do. It actually works exactly the way it should be. It should work. And now look at the comparison with how the structured Gaussian process is going to work. So in this case, we took the mean function, which has one jump only. So the exact functional form is not important. It's actually what makes it very powerful and flexible. But we took the mean function that has a jump. So notice how drastically different is the exploration process. So in this case, the structured Gaussian process will find the location of the jump, and then essentially the task is accomplished. It has found the behavior of the function. It will spend considerable amount of time exploring. After the jump is found, it will kind of spend time exploring how well are the fits on the tails of the function here and here. But the most important thing is accomplished. So we started to work with this type of models about 3 years ago. And the difference that they made for practical use of the Gaussian process is absolutely staggering, because not only you can solve the discovery optimization problem in the data sense, you also solve the discovery problem in the physics sense, which is obviously makes a big difference. So I can ask a question, does it work equally well for more complex situations? So after all, I typically show you only one-dimensional examples. And the answer is yes. So this is a slightly more complex example. So kind of bear with me in this case. So what you see here is the magnetization distribution in the Ising model. So it's very convenient test. Depending on the values of the exchange parameters. So you see that they change from -4 to 4 for the nearest neighbor and -4 to 4 to the next nearest neighbor. So here, when they both are positive, this is a ferromagnetic phase, it's yellow. Here, when they're both, one is positive and other is negative, this is anti-ferromagnetic phase. And here, when they're kind of one is negative and the second one changes from -4 to +4, these are frustrated phases when they kind of favor different orderings, and therefore we have all kind of stripes ordering and so on and so forth. So in the center, when the exchange parameters are 0, that basically means it's a high temperature, so we have a paramagnetic phases here. So the data that you see underlying this image, this is the ground truth behavior for the magnetization, which we calculated on the grid. So the dots is what happens when we explore the system using the classical Gaussian process. So you can see that the exploration path have sampled properties pretty much all over the parameter space. And on this one, you have the overlay with the prediction. So Gaussian process, yeah, okay, we run 30 simulations instead of 400. But the quality of the reconstruction is super bad, right? So we roughly reconstructed where the magnetization is high. So that part is correct. But if you compare the underlying image here and here, you can say that they're connected very weakly. And there is a reason for that, because Gaussian process is not particularly good in discovering the sharp features. And now what happens if we, rather than using the Gaussian process, we use a structured Gaussian process? So in this particular case, we introduce the probabilistic model that basically says that magnetization is 1 in some regions, 0 in other regions, and these regions are separated by a sharp boundary having this type of shape. And this boundary can have any shape in the plane J1, J2. So see what happened in this case. So the algorithm spent most of the time discovering the boundary. Here and here, it just took few measurements in order to say that this is okay. This is the region where magnetization is 1. This is the region where the magnetization is 0. So it is far more efficient. So compare this reconstruction, and the ground truth behavior. it also has limitations because, for example, this region where the magnetizations are sort of small but not zero are not discovered because they're not a part of the model. So it's not superb. But let's see how it works. So let me shift to the Colab. Share screen. Okay, so here we are. So again, this notebook is on the GitHub, so feel free to play with that. So here we are going to install the GPUX as before. We are going to install the sort of useful visualization methods. So in this case, it is just, let me run null. So we are going to install the useful visualization. So the usual NumPy and matplotlib. We are going to install the RViz because it's convenient to visualize the posterior distributions, and it kind of makes our life much more convenient overall. And then we are going to explore how the structured Gaussian processes look like and how they behave compared to the classical GPs. So first of all, we are going to start with the defining the useful function. So in this case, we choose the function which is also has the discontinuity. So on the left, on the discontinuity, the function has the form of x power b to 1. To the right of the discontinuity, the is going to be the function of x power b to 2. So we have only three parameters: the position of the jump, power law on the left, power law on the right. Again, as a useful exercise, feel free to experiment with the function and come up with the different functional forms. And then, of course, the number of parameters becomes larger. So it's a kind of good way to learn how to use the GPUX. So we define the number of parameters. So the, numerical values of the parameters. We define the noise level. We define the number of the sampling points. So this is what we get as an output. So these are our noisy observations. And of course, we can experiment with all those parameters and see how they change and how they're going to affect the behavior of the function. So let's first look how we can reconstruct this function using the standard Gaussian process. So as before, we have to introduce the noise prior. We introduce the kernel priors in order to be able to feed the function. We can examine how this distribution look like. We use our standard Gaussian process in order to reconstruct it. So in this particular case, we create the exact Gaussian process, one-dimensional, matter kernel, kernel priors as we defined above, noise priors as defined above. We fit the model. So notice that here I use only one chain for doing it fast. Practically, we can do more. We can sample the model in order to get the outputs. And this is what I get. So the output of the standard Gaussian process would be the k length, the kernel length, k scale, the kind of vertical expand of the kernel, noise, and this is the result of our fit as compared to the ground truth. As you can see, this is absolutely not super good at all. So we have a okay fit when we have a lot of points. We, of course, fit the points that we have because we have enough flexibility in the Gaussian process to fit them. But what the algorithm tried to do is to feed these points like a smooth bump rather than sharp jump. There is obviously no way for it to know that there is a jump here. And then in this part of the parameter space, it starts to go down. So the reason why, because the mean function is 0. So if our function is positive, then the prediction will try to go to 0 if we don't have any measurements point anymore. The good thing is that, of course, it generated the uncertainties, as you can see from the broad distribution of these lines. And therefore, in the realistic scenario, we will take the measurement here, and then we will reconstruct this point. but we will never be able to reconstruct this sharp jump, and I'll show you later why. So now let's try to fit this using the structured Gaussian process. So how are we going to do that? So first of all, we need to create the models that will serve as the mean function. And let's introduce the two mean functions. One is the correct mean function, which is the power law below, power law above, and some unknown position of the jump point. And the second one, that is going to be a difference, so which is a linear before and linear above with some slopes. So notice that this is a really important thing, and this in some sense is the secret opportunity that the structured Gaussian processes give us. So in order to do the Bayesian, in order to do the normal Gaussian process fit, we don't know anything about the function, and we don't care. In order to do the Bayesian inference, we need to have the functions that are right. If the function is not right, is not correct, it's going to give a very poor fit, and it will basically interpret the deviation between the function and the data generation process. So the epistemic uncertainty would be interpreted as the larger noise. But the structured Gaussian process gives us enough flexibility to use the functions that are not exactly right, but give the behaviors that are close to the right function. It's a subtle moment, but it makes all the difference between the algorithm being useful in the real world situations and being not particularly useful. So how are we going to make it a part of the model? So we have these two models, the correct one and the incorrect one. So these have to be a probabilistic model. So we need to come up with the prior distributions on the parameter values. And then all we have to do is to try to fit our model using the Gaussian process. But notice the key thing, that in GPUX, if we want to use the mean function, all we have to do is to define it and add it as an argument. So I am not aware about other packages that allow to incorporate the probabilistic mean function with this is. So I know that in the BotTorch, it's possible to provide the deterministic mean function, sort of to combine Gaussian process and least square fit. It's probably possible to create a probabilistic model. It's just going to be a fairly complex enterprise. So in the GPUX, it's a kind of convenient entry-level model where we can just incorporate it as the part of the process. So look what happens. So if we use the probabilistic mean function that is correct, then this is how our fit looks like. So in this particular case, we were able to fit our data almost precisely. So you can see that our function has discovered, so the red lines here are the sample predictions. So in the same sense as in Bayesian inference, it tries to find out what the behavior of the function may be. And basically, it looks pretty good, right? So given the experimental data, it basically tells us that the jump has to be here. We cannot pinpoint it better. So the jump can be anywhere from this measured point to this measured point. So it gives us the possible positions of the jump. We can, of course, average the red curves and get uncertainty. Sorry, find the dispersion and get uncertainty, or we can average them and we can get the mean. So it actually worked. But notice another thing, that even for the linear function, the outcome is actually not super bad, because it decided that the jump has to be here rather than here, so we don't have enough points to localize it better. But all in all, it gave us much better behavior than we did using the standard Gaussian process. So you can see that our function is not dropping to 0 down here, because our mean function is linear. We have a jump. And most importantly, we have enough flexibility in order to accommodate the deviations of the data from the probabilistic model. We can, of course, do it much more precisely. So, for example, if we know that the jump is positioned somewhere between 1.5 and 2, we can, of course, define it as a part of the model. So for this incorrect, so our real jump is at 1.7, right? So let's assume that we want to define a model where the parameters of the jump is much more precise. So we say that the jump is between 1.5 and 2.2. So in this case, if we run the structured Gaussian process, see what is going to happen. So in this case, the jump is here, but it was not terribly successful because line is difficult to fit by the parabolic, by the power law is difficult to fit by the line, but nonetheless, we were able to identify the things reasonably well. So if we increase the number of the measured points, then we'll have a even better behavior, but please experiment with it down the line. So now once we have the structured model, we of course can look at its parameters, so we can get the same type of behaviors on the prior distributions and so on and so forth, which is very convenient. And we can get it for the right model, we can get it for the incorrect model. It's sort of up to us which one to choose. So this being said, once we have the structural model, we can also use it to run the standard Gaussian process-based Bayesian optimization, or simple active learning. So as the reminder, simple active learning is that when we try to learn the function, but not the maximize optimize it. So optimization is when we try to both learn the function and optimize it, and we need to put our priority on learning or optimization, and that's what we call the exploration-exploitation balance. So the way that we run the simple active learning is we simply do the measurements at the locations when the uncertainty is highest. So how we are going to use the structured Gaussian process as the part of it? Exactly the same way as we've done before. So we start with we use exactly the same function to create our initial seed points. So these are now noisy observations. We define our exploration process. So again, it's essentially a few lines of code. So we define our outer loop, which defines the exploration. We fit the data to the model using our priors on the mean function and the mean function priors. So we define the model, then we feed the model, then we calculate the acquisition function. So and then we choose the next point where the acquisition function is maximal. So in this case, the acquisition function is UE, which means that it is the maximum uncertainty. And then the last thing we are doing is that we say that the next point is the one that we did the measurement. So we increase the list of the measurement points by the one which we have suggested. We add to the y values the value, and then we just iterate. So this is how the iteration process looks like. So again, our statistics is r hat. We want it to be close to 1. You can see how the values of parameters changes. So this is how the function discovers what the values are. And this is how the prediction using the newly discovered points look like. And this is our end answer. So what happened here is that you can follow the evolution of the active learning experiment simply by looking at where the measurement has been taken. So the way that we uncover it is that we look at the position of the crosses. So crosses were the seed points. So we didn't know where this jump is. We didn't know what happened here. So when the experiment progressed, notice that the first measurement has been taken here. So we were able to, this was our measurement number one. This measurement immediately pinpointed the behavior of this function. And then you can see that all subsequent measurements, so going from 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, they were basically trying to pinpoint the position of the jump. So the active learning implemented in the situation when you have the structured model can be actually super effective. So we can actually try to do the same type of thing with the scenario when our mean function is partially correct. So it has a jump, but the jump is the function to the left and the right of the jump is linear. So remember that this incorrect function gave us actually not super good results for the fit, right? So this is our fit. You can see that it was not very good in finding the position of this jump, and it was not very good in behavior here. But what it did do, it created a very broad uncertainty interval. So it basically said, these are the regions where I'm not sure what is actually going on. So let's see how this incorrect function is going to behave if we make it a part of the active learning. So this is, again, this is our progression of the learning. So you can see how the parameters of the model evolve as a function of iteration. So this is the slopes, this is the kernel lengths, this is the position of the jump function. So we run the 7 iterations. This is what we get in the end. So it didn't work very well in this case. So it was clearly not enough iterations. So it was still trying to figure out whether the jump is somewhere here, but nonetheless, it got fairly close. So maybe what we should do is to give it a little bit more iterations. So rather than 9, let's give it 20. And let's rerun the whole process. So the good thing is that about these light models is that they work reasonably fast. So they can be done almost in the real time. Not exactly, of course, but close to that. Okay, so let's give it a few minutes and see how the results are going to look like. So we are on the 3rd iteration here. And next time I probably should add the visualization of the curves. It will make it a little bit more convenient. Okay, so now we are starting to iterate with the partially correct function. And a very convenient metrics is the position of the jump. So since we know that the jump in our ground truth model should be at 1.7, it gives us a good comparison in figuring out whether the fit progresses well or not. So you can see that we started with 1.8, then it becomes 1.9, so it's clearly not the right location. So 2.18, it's kind of getting worse. So let's see what happens if we iterate the process a little bit longer. So now it is stuck. Okay, so now it's actually started to go back into the right direction. So we are getting to the point as 1.78. So now remember that with the Gaussian process, we always know that it will converge to the right value. So with the structured Gaussian process, I don't necessarily know the answer. So in principle, we have run a lot of experiments when we try to see whether we can converge both in terms of data and in terms of the right functional parameters. So it seems that, of course, that's possible only in the cases where we know the ground truth. It seems that we are going to get roughly to the right ballpark, but maybe not necessarily find the best fit at the same time as the right values of the function. So in some cases, this is not important. So if we want to solve the optimization problem, then having the partial knowledge is good enough, because ultimately we want to find the peak maximum. In other cases, when we want to discover the physics of the system, that of course can become a concern. In those cases, it can be far more important to discover the proper physical form at the same time. But the primary message in this case is that we need to use the mathematical tools that are best suited to the nature of our problem. So the knowledge of physics, the level of noise in the data that we have to deal with, the expected behavior of the system, and so on and so forth.
Sergey, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So has there been any, not rigorous, but maybe even rigorous studies on how much of a speed up does using GP give us compared to, let's say, a random search? Uh, Obviously, it's much better. I want to see. It's like, is it like 2 times better? Is it like 10 times better, or like 100 times better? I'm just curious.
That's an excellent question. So even for the random search, what matters quite a lot is the selection of the initial sampling points, right? So more than 100 years ago, people started to think about how to explore the search spaces optimally, even if the search space is relatively featureless Rn, right? So in these cases, grid is not very good. Interestingly, random or Latin or Sobol or whatever give a much better result. So, for example, there was a recent PhD thesis by Sterling Bayard, who is now in the Acceleration Consortium. He basically explored different seedings and kind of looked at the results rather systematically. So once you go to the Gaussian process, in principle, there is an acceleration in terms of the dimensionality of the problem, so it becomes lower than n power d. The problem with the Gaussian process in this case is that this acceleration is relatively not large and depends on the, it's depends on the dimensionality. The higher the dimensionality, the more you gain. But at the same time, this acceleration would be not universal. So when the people try to analyze the acceleration from the systematic viewpoint, they try to see how it will behave for average function. But in our cases, we typically explore the search spaces where the behavior of our function of interest would be reasonably simple. And in those cases, the true acceleration is given by the physical model. So discovering the model that is linear in parameters in very high dimensional spaces is trivial. We can do it in a linear number of steps. Discovering the linear function in 10 dimensions using Gaussian process, vice versa, is going to be a very, very difficult proposition. So we would not be able to do that. So structural Gaussian process basically allows to combine those two paradigms. So it works if the physical model is partially correct, it will work much faster than the GPA, slower than physics. But again, there is always a question of how one will balance the two, and I'm not sure if they have. I'm not aware of the studies where this type of behaviors have been studied in absolute sense, sort of trying to find out what is the acceleration factor.
Thank you.
My pleasure. So let's have a look at the results. Now that we waited through the... Okay, so now you can see that now it actually converged very well. You can determine when it converged. So it happens somewhere about this step 17. And you can see how it converged. So again, this color scale shows you how the exploration was going on. So remember that in this case, our structured Gaussian process has the wrong function. So we are trying to fit the function that is very obviously power law by the function which is at core linear. So nonetheless, it worked reasonably well because you can see how the exploration process happens. So in the beginning, the first several points have been spent trying to pinpoint the behavior of the function here. Because from the point of view of the Gaussian process, this can be a jump, not necessarily this one. So then it started to explore the values here to make sure that we have the correct behaviors and correct value of the function here. And then you can see that in the end, somewhere throughout the process, we actually figure out where the jump itself is. So this is actually super cool because we took the model that represents only one aspect of the physics of the system, meaning the presence of the sharp jump. And this model used this knowledge in order to find the jump, and the flexibility imparted by the Gaussian process was enough to accommodate the behavior to the left and to the right of the jump when the functional form is wrong. So this is actually the greatest thing about this SGP and this and the structural probabilistic models. So then, in order to illustrate how these things work, I have also added the example of the Bayesian optimization using the SGPs. So in this case, we try to solve the minimization problem. So we use our UCB acquisition function. So you can experiment and see how the function evolves, what happens at each optimization step, and so on and so forth. And kind of please feel free to experiment with making it more greedy, less greedy, and so on and so forth. So notice that as is normal with the discovery problems, with optimization problems, our chances to getting trapped in the local minimum would be much larger than it is for the discovery. But anyway, so feel free to experiment with that and see how fast it can converge and how fast it will discover the right value. Okay, so this being said, let's look at the, let's continue and look at the interesting development in this direction, which is something that we call the, what we call is the hypothesis learning. Let me first illustrate the problem. So imagine the scenario so the structured Gaussian process effectively means that I have a model for the system behavior as long as this model captures some relevant aspects of the physics, it will work much better than the normal Gaussian process. And in some sense, I can say that the normal Gaussian process is the null model. This means that I don't know anything about the physics of the system. But in many scenarios, I actually have the competing hypothesis about the physics of the system. So I can say that in the examples that I gave you, for example, I want to know the behavior of the mobility across the concentration space. Maybe the mobility is going to be depressed due to the mixed whatever alkali effect, or maybe the mobility is going to be enhanced because of some positive interaction and doping effects. So in other words, if we start to explore a new system, very often we are going to have more than one possible model of how the system will behave. And in some sense, these models would be a hypothesis, not a hypothesis, hypothesis about what may be happening in the system. So now imagine that we have an active learning scenario where we want to explore some system in such a way that we both optimize certain property and discover the right model of the system behavior. So what the system can be is virtually everything. It can be synthesis. For example, chemical synthesis, and then our parameter space is basically the control knobs that we tune during the synthesis. Can be film growth. It can be a physical measurement, right? So for example, I can create the combinatorial library, and in this case, I need to choose where to do the measurement. So we have synthesized all the compounds, and now our problem is where to run the measurements, how to sequence them, because measurement is actually time consuming. So this is our parameter space. So what we want to do is we want to perform a physical measurement. Of course, the physical measurement can give us a complex output, like some form of vector, whatever. Practically, we will always reduce it down to a certain scalar property. And then we are going to have the structured Gaussian process. So what we want to get from structural Gaussian process is to refine the physical model, so update the priors to posteriors, and also tell us where to run the next measurement. So this is the discovery cycle in the normal Bayesian optimization or Bayesian optimization based on the SGPs, and it is the same everywhere. But now imagine that we have more than one possible model for the structured Gaussian process. So we have one model, we can have second model, and so on. So each model, once we run the experiment, we would be able to update all models. So no matter how many models we have, we can use the Bayesian inference in order to update priors to the posteriors. However, each of the models will select a different region in the parameter space to perform the exploration. So in some sense, model one says that, you know what, my maximum uncertainty is in this part of the parameter space, go there. Model number two will say, you know what, my predictive uncertainty is maximum in this part of parameter space, go here. So how are we going to do that? And in some form, this is kind of very similar to how the human scientists can work. So imagine that you and your colleague work on the tool where you have, it's either you using the instrument or your colleague is using the instrument. You have competing ideas about what model describes the system behavior. So the question becomes, how would you leverage the development of the model versus the deciding who is going to use the tool? And the answer is that maybe it is reasonable to give everybody a try in order to make sure that we don't follow the long pathway, but at the same time, come up with a way how we reward the person who is right more often. And that's exactly what the hypothesis learning is doing. So using the same type of, so let me show you a few examples in the PowerPoint, and then I'll show you the Colab that allows to repeat this experiment and kind of experiment by yourself. So imagine that we have some form of the system which and have three competing models. So what the hypothesis learning tried to do is at the same time learn the data distribution while identifying the complex model. So if the model gives the better prediction, it is more likely to kind of get to drive the experimental system. If not, we still allow for algorithm like epsilon greedy, even for the wrong model, to try new things to make sure that we are not trapped in a specific region of the model space. This is the example when we have three models. So we start with the model number three. The model number three chose the measurement and kind of reduced its uncertainty. So this model is training. Then the epsilon greedy algorithm kicked in. We tried the model number two. The predictive uncertainty has increased, so that's not a good model. Then we used the model number one. Didn't work very well. It worked reasonably well. But then again, epsilon greedy kicked in, so we got the model number two. Then we deferred to model number three again. It started to increase the predictive uncertainty. So then the algorithm said, you know what? I want the model number one to run again because it worked reasonably well. So, but it didn't work very well. So instead of going down, it actually went up. So it switched back to the model number three. And then it turns out that after doing it for some time, we came to conclusion that model number three is actually the right model to predict our data. And we can run it 30 times and see which model gets reward more often. So we have experimented with this quite a lot, trying to benchmark it against the standard GP and Bayesian optimization, and it turned out that it actually works reasonably well. So you can read a paper about it in the MLST about 2 years ago. But then the question becomes, can we run it in the real world scenario? And this is the part where it becomes pretty interesting, but very much domain dependent, because most of the time we have hypotheses about what's happening in our system, but this hypothesis exists in the form which is has a lot of phenomenological and heuristic type of knowledge. This is good, this is bad. Very rarely we have the hypothesis in the form of the mathematical expression. So, for example, for us, after kind of spending quite a lot of time thinking about it, we found 2 examples where the hypothesis type of approach can work in the real world applications. And unsurprisingly, these examples are very well tuned to the specific domain in which I am specializing. So the first of those examples is the domain switching using the tip. So the example is very simple. We have a ferroelectric material. It can have polarization up or down. If I have the tip of the scanning probe microscope, I can apply bias to it and essentially cause the polarization to flip. Now, if I form a domain inside the material, I can actually enumerate the possible hypotheses about how the domain size as the function of time and voltage pulse magnitude can behave. So for example, one limiting case is that the domain size would be determined by the thermodynamics of the process. So it turns out that depending on the details of the structure of the domain wall, it's actually 2 models rather than 1. But in both cases, the domain size depends on voltage, but not time. So thermodynamic is thermodynamic. So this third model is that I apply a bias and the progression of the domain depends on the pinning of the domain wall in the disordered media. So this is a very well-established statistical physics scenario. So in this case, I know that the dependence of the domain size as a function of time and voltage should go like this. And the last model is that the size of the domain depends on the rate of the charge injection at the tip surface junction. So in this case, I know that the domain cannot grow unless the depolarization fields are compensated. And I can say that the possible limiting mechanism is this compensation by the injected charges. So these are limiting cases. We are either limited by this process or we are limited by this process, but probably not by both of them at the same time. And with this, I can actually formulate my hypothesis. And this is actually the example of how the hypothesis learning algorithm works on the real world experimental system. So what you see here, this is the control computer. This is the oscilloscope that shows us the probe position. And this is our measured signal. So the way that experiment works is that we go to some location on the sample and we apply the bias pulse with a certain magnitude and voltage. After we apply the bias pulse, we scan the region so you can see how the probe moves. If you look very carefully, you can even see how it moves here. And then what you see is how the domain is being visualized. So you can see that we have created a domain, and then we can use a fairly simple machine learning algorithm in order to determine the domain size. In some sense, we just need to count the number of the bright pixels. Once we determine the domain size, what we are going to do is first we send this information back to the control computer, and we start the training of our hypothesis learning model. And while the model is being trained, we also kind of clean our region. We basically remove this domain and create an empty spot. So what you see in this short video is basically a single operational cycle when we have a determined plan the experiment, run the experiment, apply the voltage bias, measure the result of the experiment, the size of the domain, And then we prepare the surface for the new experiment and analyze the results at the same time. So this is how it looks like if we analyze the experimental trajectory after the experiment. So these are the data that we collect. This is how we determine the domain sizes. This is our exploration space. So it's a bias, voltage bias, and the logarithm of the bias pulse lengths. And these are our 4 models. And this is the reward that we give the model. So if the model is correct, we give it a reward. So we start with the initial seed points. Then we, and in fact, we overdid it. Then we start to see how the models compete with each other. So you can see that first we start to give reward to the third model, then the algorithm become not sure, and then in the end, the third model is the one winning because other models are clearly much worse. So why is this important? This, of course, is the toy example because practically we have two-dimensional parameter space, we have relatively simple hypotheses, and so on and so forth. But practically, this is exactly the case where the instrument worked as the automated scientist. So we started with the 4 competing hypotheses. We know that these hypotheses represent the full spectrum of possibilities of what may be happening in the system. The microscope have chosen experimental parameter so that establish which one is correct. And that's a kind of hypothesis-driven discovery. And of course, we are not, in principle, limited to running this type of experiment for domain switching. So let me show you a material science example, which at that time was less successful, but now almost 3 years later, it actually started to work much better now that we have an automated experiment to do that. So this is the example of the combinatorial library. So on the left, we have a pure samarium doped bismuth ferrite. So this is our ferroelectric phase. On the right, we have the samarium doped one. This is anti-ferroelectric phase. We know that in between there are some interesting phases corresponding to a morphotropic phase boundary. We want to use the AFM, so we can use AFM to measure this piezo response hysteresis loops. We want to run the automated experiment in such a way that we find the structural model that is physical model that describes the evolution of the ferroelectric properties across this combinatorial space. So the first thing to do was to come up with the model. So in this case, we said that our first hypothesis is that this is a first order phase transition, meaning that we have a jump, and for first order phase transition, we can get this type of behavior. Our other model is going to be the second order phase transition. So in this case, we don't have a jump. So at that time, we had 2 problems. So the problem number 1 was that this was done manually, so we didn't have the automated stage now. So as you can imagine, now that we have the automated stage, this becomes much more interesting to do it when the experiment is fully automated. So we did the experiment manually, and you can see that this was inconclusive. So in the end, it's difficult to say whether the model 1 or 2 is better, and their predictions are actually fairly close. Secondly, the reason why it didn't work particularly well is because realistically, the properties of the material show the peak around the morphotropic boundary, but neither of the models predict the peak. So both of them show the monotonic decay of the data. So this is the example when neither of the models is correct. So it worked somehow, but not super good. So now, of course, kind of one of the big priorities for our team now is to start to use the fully automated microscope with a large stage exactly to run this type of experiments, because now we can do the tunes fully automatic way. We can do the macroscopic motion of the sample across the sample using the large combinatorial library. And most importantly, we have come up with much more reliable ways to explore the complex combinatorial libraries than just one measurement when we come with a very strongly biased notions about what's important and what's not important. So figuring out what to explore and what is the optimize is actually a very, very big part of this type of experiments. So this being said, let me show you the example of how the hypothesis learning works in Python environment. So let me switch to the Colab, and we are briefly going to talk about the hypothesis learning itself, and also by the concept of policies and the decision making in the active learning. So generally, acquisition function is the example of the policy, but policies can be much more complicated than that. So anyway, again, this notebook is already on the Colab. So again, feel free to play with that. So the way it starts is by now very well familiar. We do the installs and imports. We create some helping functions that will help us plot and analyze the data, so we don't have to do it over and over again. Then we generate some data. So this is the example when we use the same type of discontinuous function, which is power law on the left of the jump and power law to the right of the jump. So our function parameter is the jump position and the power law. So it's pretty steep here. It's of power 4. It's much more smooth here. It's only power 2.5. And then, of course, we assume that we add a little bit of the noise here. And just to make life more interesting, we use the JAX noise function rather than anything else. So this is how our function look like. So then we need to define the hypothesis. So notice that when we have a Bayesian inference, we create a probabilistic model. Or we can create multiple probabilistic models, feed them to the data, and then we choose which of the models is correct based on the VAEC. When we run the SGP, we create a single probabilistic model. We can make it a part of the simple active learning when we try to discover the function, or we can make it a part of the Bayesian optimization. So in this process, we simultaneously try to discover, optimize the function, and we also learn our function better. So we, rather than having we sort of go from having priors on the parameters to posteriors. And posteriors represent the additional knowledge accrued during the experiment. And since the experiment is active, these two things are kind of balanced. So once we run the hypothesis learning, we actually extend this concept one step further. So we define several possible hypothesis functions. So in this case, we create one which is correct one, which is power law on the left, but linear on the right of the jump position. We define the second one, which is linear on the left and linear on the right. And then we define the third one, which is power law on the left and power law on the right. So this is the correct model. This is, I mean, it's not incorrect. It just it doesn't have the right behavior to the left and to the right, but it still has a jump. And this one has the right behavior on the left of the jump and the incorrect behavior on the right of the jump. So these are our hypotheses. So our next step is to define the priors on those parameters. So the probabilistic model is never complete unless we define the priors on the parameters. Again, in this case, we define the fairly broad and non-informative priors. Notice that in principle, we can have a hypothesis where the functional form is the same, but the big difference would be in priors. For example, if we can have one model where the distribution is from 0.5 to 1 and another where it is from 1.5 to 2, this would be two different hypotheses. But in this case, we chosen to have the almost, so in other words, everything matters, both the functional forms and the prior distributions. So in this case, we chosen the priors to be roughly the same for parameters, but this is done for the convenience and because we have an abstract example, not because it is the right thing to do. So now, once we have this, we are going to also define the custom priors on the Gaussian process kernel. So same as before, and on nice. And now we start to have the kind of the hypothesis learning cycle. So let's have a look about what goes inside the cycle and how the decision is being made. So we have one function that basically examines some object called record and finds the argmax of this record. So this basically says that there are models. Each model has a record of its past behavior. We are going to choose the one for which this record is best. So the second function is the update of the record. So this is basically, we say that we have the past record of the function behavior. We take a new action. Depending on the action, one of them got the good result. So the one that got the good result is going to have its record increased by 1. So the last thing is that we can choose the we need to give the reward. So this is what this is how it is done. So if the integral uncertainty at the current step is smaller than the median uncertainty at previous step, then we give the positive reward. If not, then negative reward. So this is basically how we choose which model is better and which model is worse, based on how the predictive uncertainty evolved. And then everything else will already be fairly familiar. So we start with introduce the step function that allows us, that defines how the next step, what happens on each step of the hypothesis learning process. So we define the acquisition function. So in this case, it's uncertainty. We plot summaries. This is the additional diagnostic function that we are not going to talk about. So then this is our learning cycle. So we define the Gaussian process model as usual using the one-dimensional spaces, Mattern function, defined kernels, define model priors, define the noise priors. So you see that all the things that we learned over the last 3 lectures, they start to become a part of the model. So kernels, mean functions, priors for the mean functions, and priors for noise. We fit our model. So as before, we check that the process kind of conversion didn't start to get divergence. So we make a check that if this conversion criteria bad, then we should stop. And then we basically compute our acquisition function and then return the acquisition function and the model. And then this part of the code is essentially the bookkeeping when we make sure that the points at which we did the measurement become measurement point and the unmeasured points list is basically removed from the list of opportunities. Then we create the seed points, so we need to start somewhere. And this is how the hypothesis learning cycle works. So notice that let's first look at the outputs because it's more fun, and then we look at what is going to happen inside. So in the beginning, we start with the warm-up step. So warm-up step means that we have 3 models. We are going to fit all 3 models to the data, and we are going to do it 3 times. So that kind of makes perfect sense because here you will see that we have 3 warm-up steps, and that basically means that initially we have experimental data, and we are going to fit all 3 models to get the answers to that. And then we start to pick the model that gives us the better reward based on the usual usual criteria. So this is what happens if we run the model number one. So these are the rewards it has given us. So it's not terribly good. And you see that the quality of the fit is actually fairly low. So the acquisition function is relatively, has a structure which basically tells you that the uncertainty is high everywhere, except for the locations when the measurements have been taken. And we know how the ground truth should look like, and you can see that this behavior is very different from the ground truth. And the uncertainty interval is large. So this is clearly not a good model. So this is what happens then if we switch to the third model. So the third model is the right model. So you can see that the fit in this case is much better. And in fact, the acquisition function shows the peak close to the jump position, which basically tells us that it's not confident where the jump is, and everything else is kind of happy about. And there is a large uncertainties over here. So then we go to the second model. So this one is horrible. So this try to be linear, and you can see how it behaves. So right, so this is our line on the left of the jump. This is our line on the right of the jump. You can clearly see that the function doesn't want to fit it. As the result, we have a very high uncertainties. So when the uncertainty interval looks like this, and the function kind of changes very rapidly, that means that our kernel length is very low. If the kernel length is very low, that basically means that close to the measurement point, the algorithm has some certainty about what goes on. But if we move away from it even a little bit, it's no longer certain what goes on. So the uncertainty is now as large as the noise level suggests it should be. It's a purely aleatoric uncertainty of the data. But at the same time, the trend now is a linear function rather than zero. So simple GP would revert to zero. The SGP reverts to the mean function behavior. It's not certain where the jump is, and kind of tries to experiment with it in the different ways. But this is clearly not a good fit. And the reason why we know that it's not, and we know that it's not a good fit because the uncertainty is high, and the fits are very different from the ground truths. But the way the algorithm knows that this is not a good fit is simply because the uncertainty is high. So this algorithm doesn't get the reward. So, and then we kind of continue the process, and then we go to the, again, model 3. Okay, this is the right model, it fits well, our uncertainties is low. And then we can kind of continue this process. I'll go back to the code where it happened, but notice that sometimes we go back to the wrong model. And we do that in order to avoid being trapped in the false minimum, because if we use the greedy algorithm, we can simply get trapped in the metastable minimum. So in this case, the quality is better. We have more points and the jump is localized, but nonetheless, the fit is not super good. So then we go again to the model 1. Again, the fit is horrible, and we know why. So then the process is repeated multiple times, and in the end of the process, what we get is our exploration trajectory. So we get the median uncertainty. So we started with the model number 2. Then we experimented with the model number 3. Then we chose the model number 1. Things become much worse. We go back to the model number 3. We tried the model number 2. Things got much worse. We went to the model number 3. And then we have experimented with it several times. And in the end, we settled on the model number 3 as the correct one. So we keep a track of the rewards for the model. So this is a running indicator. Therefore, you see only 3 of them. So the model number 3 got the minus 0.4 reward. Model number 2, and we used it 5 times. Model number 2 was used 7 times, and we got reward also negative. But the model number 3 is the right one. So in the end of the process, we can have 3 models, and we can see how the prediction by all 3 models compare. So this is the model number 1, which is the power law and linear. So you can see what the parameters are, and you see where the jump is, you see the exploration's trajectory. So this is the model number 2, so the line and the jump. That one didn't work at all. So we clearly cannot fit this data by line very well. And by now you're already very much used to the how the Gaussian processes look like when the fit did not converge very well. And the model number 3 behaved exceptionally well, as we kind of wanted it to be. Notice that our noise was pretty high, so our values are pretty much off, but ultimately it worked. Now let's go back to the original code and see how was it realized, at least in the most general steps. So in this case, we have the number of exploration steps. This is straightforward. We have a number of the warm-up steps. This is also straightforward. So we have the models, we have the parameters that allow us to save the reconstructions. Now, the very interesting part here is this parameter epsilon, which is chosen to be 0.4. So this is the example of how in the decision-making workflows, we can vary the exploration versus exploitation. So what I mean by that is that once we write the hypothesis learning, we essentially are trying to combine two processes. One is how to discover the data using the how to do the SGP fit to the data. And second, how to choose the next exploration point. So each of the models that we have will suggest each own exploration point. We know that it is actually very, very possible and happens all the time to get the model that is very different from the ground truth, but at the same time comes with a low predictive uncertainty. So in other words, the algorithm can be wrong, but not know that it is wrong. So again, it's a very important thing because once we have any kind of surrogate model like GP or neural network or Bayesian inference and so on and so, or conformal prediction, so on and so forth, the great thing about them is that they give a prediction and uncertainty. But the uncertainty is what the model thinks about its prediction. It's not any objective or reliable measure of the difference between the surrogate model and the real model. So in other words, it's a suggestion. It's not a ground truth. If it were a ground truth, then we wouldn't have any problems running optimization workflows at all. So it is possible and happens all the time that the model can converge to the point where the predictive uncertainty is very small, but at the same time, the model is very different from the ground truth. If that happens, that means that we are stuck in the metastable minimum, and we need to find a way to get out of it. The simplest way to do that is to use what is called the epsilon greedy method, which basically means that most of the time we use the model that we think is best, but we give other models a shot. So with the probability of epsilon, we are going to choose a different model. So in this case, we choose the epsilon fairly large because we have a fairly short exploration step. So we can, if we have more explorations, we can make it a little bit shorter, a little bit smaller. More importantly, we can use the epsilon fairly high in the beginning. So there we explore different models and then kind of make it small by the end of the exploration. Then we essentially switch from exploratory policy to more exploitative one when we stick to one model. So in other words, there are other ways of doing that. So another policy for sampling different models is called softmax. We basically give every model a chance proportional to the reward that it has. So there are different ways of doing that. In our case, it's a simple decision making. So we use simple policies. It gets far more complicated once we have a multi-step decision processes. So like reinforcement learning, there the choice of policies becomes the basically science by itself. So anyway, that's a kind of secret sauce that allows us to explore different models. So everything else is relatively straightforward. So we keep a track of our process. So we have our record. So we have the list where we store the choice of models and the histories. Then see what happens during the warm-up. So we have our median predictions and our objective functions. So we, for each model from the list, so we have 3 models, we run Bayesian inference and store the uncertainty values. So this is what is done here. So notice that we have an outer loop where we run this for the number of warm-up steps. And then within each step of the warm-up, we sample all models in the list. So we have 3 models, so we'll try all 3. Then we store our objective functions. So in this case, we use the median, but we can use the integral, it doesn't matter. And then we give a reward to the model that has the smallest uncertainty. So that's all there is to that. Then we store this parameter, and then we compute the next measurement point using the predictive uncertainty of the model that got the reward. So if the model got the reward, then we evaluate the function of the selected points, and then we update the data. So basically at this warm-up state, we calculate all 3 models, and we give the reward to the one which is best. So then we are going to the exploration step. So in this case, we choose the model based on the epsilon greedy. So we choose either the model that we think is best, meaning gives the minimal predictive uncertainty, or we choose the random model. So we calculate the acquisition function using the selected model. We calculate our reward, we get the record, and then we evaluate the function of the selected point. So we do the measurement, and that's basically all there is to that. So we try other models and following the epsilon greedy, but generally we think that the model gives the best prediction, then that's the best model. So the last thing that I would like to show today is how we go from one-dimensional to the 2 or higher dimensional examples. So let me show you with you the final notebook. It's also on the GitHub. So this is the notebook where I have so that's a huge notebook because it has examples of everything, kind of going from the regular Gaussian process, structured Gaussian process, and hypothesis learning. So this is the example of where we run the GPACs in the 2-dimensional spaces. So, I mean, of course, it can be run in 3 or 4-dimensional spaces, but then it's becoming a little bit more difficult to visualize the example. So 2D is the last dimension where it is easier to show the results. So this notebook is essentially the integration of the previous ones and shows how we can run Gaussian optimization in 2-dimensional spaces, like ternary diagrams and so on. So we install the GPACs as before, we install the input, so we generate the data. So this particular notebook has been inspired by the research in the hybrid perovskites. So we created a number of models that predict the concentration dependence of the band gap in the materials where we vary the component on the A side and on the B side. So in some sense, this is not a ternary phase diagram. It's actually the 2 binary phase diagrams, because A side can go from 0 to 1 and B side has to go from 0 to 1. It's not like the sum has to be 1 as well. So we introduced several models. So one model is that dependence in one dimension is linear and the second dimension is linear, so it's plane. This is an example of, in one case it's parabolic and the other is linear. This is vice versa. And third, it is parabolic in both dimensions. So these are 4 different models. So we create a function to create the synthetic data. We create the ground truth parameters because we need to compare with it. And we define our mean functions. So in this particular case, we create the several possible mean functions kind of corresponding to our models. And then we create alternative mean function, which is the Gaussian function. So this is our probabilistic model. So our ground truth is the simple polynomials, but we of course don't know that. Therefore, we can use for the trial function something which is much more complicated. And once we have those, we can simply proceed to define the SGP steps. So notice how it looks like. So the only difference is that our probabilistic functions are two-dimensional now. So they have x becomes two-dimensional, and when we define the function, we choose the first element of x or the second element of x. So this is x, this is y. Our call to the Gaussian process, exact Gaussian process model, changes very little. We just specified that the input dimension is 2. Everything else remained the same. We have the kernels, kernel priors, function priors, noise priors, and so on and so forth. And of course, you can define these priors as well. And then we feed the model, and this is the output. So this is how the exploration in this case is going to look like. This is how the, sorry, this is not exploration, this is the defining of the initial seed points. So these are the seed points where we took the measurements. So basically what we do is we start with the seed points, and then we try to fit it to the Gaussian process. So this is how the exploration will look like if we have the simple GP. So in this case, our model is just a Gaussian process, not structured. So this is our posterior mean. This is prediction. This is the uncertainty distribution. We calculate the acquisition function based on the mean and uncertainty. And if we keep doing it, you will see the several steps of the usual Gaussian discovery process. So we can run the prediction, then we get the posterior mean, we can compare it to the ground truth, we can look at the difference. So we can, of course, play with the way the data is represented. So in this case, we just plot a circle at each position on the grid. So we can run the same type of approach using the structured Gaussian process. Again, this is the experiment example how we do it using 3 exploration steps. So you can see that the outputs would be the kernel lengths in both dimensions, the scale, noise, and then the parameters of our model. So in this case, we've chosen the Gaussian model. So this is the posteriors of the SGP model. Again, we get several steps. It didn't work particularly well, but we didn't try too hard. And again, we can look at the posterior mean and the ground truth behavior. And then we can, I mean, we didn't realize it, but it's not terribly difficult to realize the same thing for the Bayesian optimization. So all you have to do is to go to the step function, and rather than running, so this is our step function. So we use the acquisition function to be the uncertainty. We can use the, actually, where do we have it? Okay, so we return the value of the function. So this is the place where we calculate the uncertainty over the parameter space. So all we have to do is to, rather than calculate the uncertainty, we need to calculate the acquisition function, and instead of argmax of the uncertainty, we need to calculate the argmax of the acquisition function. And then instead of the exploration, we are going to have the optimization. And then the last element is the hypothesis learning. So this is already becomes a serious project. So it's not a relatively short code, because we have to provide multiple competing models. We have to provide their priors. We need to define the utility functions. So that's actually probably more code development than the 3 other notebooks that I have shown you, because it combines all of them. But the way it works is exactly the same as before. So we define our hypothesis learning loop with exploration, warm up, the competing models. And after we run it, we essentially get a somewhat anticlimactic answer that tells us that the good model is the model number 2, and that actually ends up being the right model that we put in it from the very beginning. And then, of course, for all the models, we have the posteriors, and then we can look at them and basically figure out how the exploration happened. So this is the point where I would like to stop. Are there any questions?